Marvel Epic Collection, The Mighty Thor, War of the Gods, aka Thor Volume 8, 1975 to 1977. And the issues collected in this edition are listed on the index page. As you can see here, it goes all the way from Thor 242 in December 1975 to Thor 259 in May 1977. The annual from 1976 is placed at the end of the collection because it's outside of the main storyline, and I'll hopefully get around to talking about that later in the review. So this is actually the first Marvel Epic Collection comic book that I've read. I've certainly been hearing a lot about this collection from Epic Comic Book Wednesday and Steve Donahue's channel and Michael K. Vaughn's channel. But I've never had the opportunity to read one of these myself, and I was very impressed by this volume. It was a lot of fun. There was a lot of imagination. This is the best superhero comic collection I've read in quite some time, and I would like to talk about why I enjoyed it so much. But in order to do that, I think I'm going to have to give some background about my own experience reading comic books, because that will put into context my own thoughts about this and show what I was reacting to. So, apologies if my own personal history with this is not interesting to anybody else. As always, feel free to skip this review, but I'm going to go ahead and try and lay out some of my comic book history. So, as a kid growing up in the 80s, these comic books from the late 70s, by the way, are just slightly before my time. But growing up in the 80s, I was fascinated by comic books, as all kids are, but I didn't really have access to them. My parents didn't approve of comic books. They were conservative Christians. I lived out in the suburbs, and growing up, we didn't go into town very much, so I didn't have access to bookstores or comic books or any way of getting a hold of them. I did in the early 90s, when I was 15 and 16 and had some spare cash from doing some part-time jobs and access to a car. I had access to comic book stores and comic books, and I did start buying them for a couple of years. By that time, I was just about ready to age out of them anyways. By 15, or especially 16, 17, I guess you're kind of getting a little bit too old for comic books. 7 or 8 would have been the ideal age to encounter these. But I did have a couple years when I tried to read as many comic books as my limited amount of money would allow me to, because it's an expensive hobby, isn't it? Keeping up with comics. And in part because it was an expensive hobby and because there were so many comic books to read, I made the decision at the time that I wasn't going to try and follow both DC and Marvel. And I went with DC Comics because I was more familiar with them from Super Friends growing up, and DC Comics just seemed to me at the time to be more iconic, more recognizable characters that I was interested in. So I didn't really read a lot of Marvel comics at all when I was younger. Although I've since, especially with the growth of the internet and Wikipedia, I've since had a greater appreciation for the Stan Lee Revolution and Marvel comic books' place in the cultures, things that weren't a lot of things that weren't known to me when I was younger. But anyways, over the years, I've become a little bit more interested in it. I guess, like a lot of people, my main introduction to Thor has been the Marvel Cinematic movies. And when the Thor movies first came out, I was I think, like a lot of people, very intrigued with all the weird things about them. The Rainbow Bridge in Asgard, and the dark elves and the trolls, and all those little details. And I didn't really know about that much about Norse mythology either. I was into Greek mythology when I was younger, but didn't really know anything about Norse mythology. So I think, like a lot of people, when those movies came out, I went to Wikipedia to look up a lot of this stuff and was curious about it, and was surprised to how many of the details of the Thor from the comic books had its origins in the ancient Norse mythology, even stuff that seems like it's straight out of a trippy, weird 1970s sci-fi comic, like that rainbow bridge that they travel on to get between Asgard and Earth, actually all came straight from the original mythology. And partly based on that interest, mostly based on that interest, actually, I read Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman a couple of years ago, and reviewed it on this channel, and really enjoyed it. So, yeah, I guess that's mostly my background with Thor. I did actually, a few years ago when I was studying at the University of Melbourne Library, they did have some of the Marvel Essential comic book collections in their library. And I did read part of, I think, Thor 1, which was from the early 60s. And was very different from this volume from the late 70s. The primary difference is that in those early volumes, Thor is he has like a secret identity. He's a lame doctor, a doctor who can't walk properly. He's got a crutch. And one day the doctor finds the hammer of Thor out in the woods or something. And when he holds the hammer of Thor, he can turn into Thor. But when he lets go of the hammer of Thor, he turns back into the doctor who can't walk. And that was an interesting angle. I think that went along with Stan Lee's idea that all these heroes have to have like a weak point or an angst point. Heroes with feet of clay, as Steve Donahue refers to it on his channel. But it was. Arguably, it was an interesting innovation to have heroes who had emotional catches that would make you invested in them. Now, at some point, and I'm not exactly sure when, that angle must have gotten dropped because it is nowhere in these pages. I was looking at this on Wikipedia earlier, and it was a little bit hard to tell from Wikipedia exactly when that angle got dropped. But at this point, in the late 70s, I guess, in the Thor comics, it's just all Dr. Thor. Sorry. It's just all Thor. He does not have a secret identity. There is no lame Dr. Donald Blake. Except, this is interesting, except they still have that heading at the beginning of every issue. So when lame Dr. Donald Blake strikes his wooden walking stick upon the ground, it becomes a mystic mallet. How do you suppose you pronounce that? Mjolnir. And Blake is transformed into the Norse god of thunder, master of the storm and lightning, heir to the thorn of the immortal Asgard. Stanley presents the mighty Thor. So this little heading actually starts out most of these stories, despite the fact that the lame Dr. Donald Blake is nowhere in here. I don't know. Again, like I said at the beginning of this video, I guess my here he is. There's The awesome origin of Thor's alter ego, Don Blake. But actually, this, even though the cover is included here, this issue is not included in this collection because apparently that issue was just a reprint. I don't know why. I don't know why issue 254 of Thor was apparently just a random reprint, and then they went back to the main story. It may have been nice with these epic collections to have like a forward or an afterword, giving some of the background or history or editorial decisions behind this. I guess that maybe that would be my one small complaint, one of my small complaints about this. But yeah. Anyways, where was I? Was interested in comics in my youth. Read some DC comics, but didn't really know that much about Marvel. And then I every so often, I don't know, maybe every 10 years ago, I get a little bit nostalgic for comics and revisit them. And if you've been watching this channel, you'll know I'm on one of those kicks right now. I've been reading a lot of comics on this channel. I've been somewhat hampered by the fact that I live in Asia, which makes it sometimes difficult to get comics. Although here in Vietnam, it's getting easier. These were in the bookstores. This and one other Marvel Epic collection. This is the price here in Vietnamese dong, which is roughly equivalent to the U.S. price here. So it's a little bit pricey, but I decided I really wanted it. So after weighing it up for some time, went ahead and splurged on it. So yeah, but it's the first time I've seen these in Vietnamese bookstores. I guess they're becoming more available now. So that's one reason I've not read any Marvel Epic collections up until now. So this is my first exposure to Marvel Epic collections. So with all that background out of the way, maybe I can go through and talk about what I really liked about this. I was earlier this year. I reviewed some of the very early Marvel Stan Lee works. So Captain America, the early Captain America issues, the early Avengers issues, and as I said in my reviews of those comics, and I'll link to them in the description down below, there's a lot of mythologizing about the golden age of Marvel in the early 60s and the magic that Stan Lee was working. But I don't know. When you go back and read those early issues, they are just so boring. At least it seems to me. I mean, I guess Stan Lee and Jack Kirby get some credit for their creativity in thinking up all these characters. But then the actual issues seem to be very uninventive stories where there's just a bad guy and they fight the bad guy. And there doesn't really seem to be anything interesting going on in there. But if that was the case in the early 60s, I guess by the late 70s, these comics were starting to come into their own. At least in my opinion, because here we are in the late 70s, and this is really, for my money, doing a lot of innovative things. I had read some DC comics from the late 70s, back when I was into comic book collecting. They were a little bit expensive because they were back issues that I bought at the comic book store, and they were $10 a comic book or something because they were so old. And I remember thinking that they weren't really all that good or all that interesting, or that there was something even as early as the early 90s when I was reading those comics from the late 70s. They seemed like they were written for a different generation. But this actually seems to me even though this is coming from the late 70s, to be still quite very readable and entertaining now. Okay, now that I've given all that introduction, let me start talking about why I think this was so entertaining and memorable. So it starts off with the storyline, and because comic books are always an ongoing story, we start off getting dropped off in the middle of a story. And, it would be nice to start at the beginning of a story, but to start at the beginning of a story, you'd have to go all the way back to Thor #1, I guess, because in Marvel Comics, everything's always a continuing story. So in this continuing story, they're rescuing Odin, who had been on Earth for some time and had some period of amnesia. And then Odin disappears. It seems like he's going back to Asgard, although we find out later that he never made it to Asgard. And in fact, the mystery of where Odin actually ended up going is going to be a mystery that is going to continue all throughout this collection. And we're going to get to the end of this collection, and Odin is still going to be missing. Which is, when you look at the dates on this, it's a storyline that got spread out over, it looks like, at least a couple years, and who knows how much further it went. And again, this is something I remember a little bit from when I was reading DC comic books in the early 90s. Is just storylines would continue over several issues to the point where it could go for a couple years or more, a single storyline, and because these comic books only come out once a month, that's only 12 issues or only 24 issues. So when you put them all in a collection like this, I guess it's not that much story. But when you're reading it in real time, it seems like it goes on forever, especially when you're young, because time passes a lot differently when you're young, right? Time is a lot slower to somebody who's 15 or 16 or even younger, reading these at 8 or 9, where a couple years is just like an eternity. So to have these story arcs spread out over that long of a time, I imagine must have been quite interesting for the young kids who were reading it. Comic books are like soap operas for little boys in that way, with just kind of continuing story arcs that go for episodes and episodes or issues and issues. Anyways, Thor and his friends are celebrating, and then they meet with what's his name again? Tomorrow Man, who wants them to get into his time machine because there's these time twisters who are traveling through time, and this is time that's linear here, and this is the time twisters path. They're traveling backwards through time on a twisting path, and every time that their path crosses into the linear time, it reduces everything to a cinder, causes some huge cosmic upheaval. So this is some great science fiction writing here. Of course, it's combining science fiction with fantasy, because Thor and his friends are from the Norse mythology. So they get into the Tomorrow Man's time machine, and they encounter all these different monsters and soldiers from all different times in the time stream. And they finally set up back in the, in the 25th century. But they're too late. The time twisters are already here. And I mean, look at this panel. There they are, Asgardians. The time twisters walk among us. And unless we can somehow defeat them, the entire planet is doomed. I mean, this is just classic comic book fun of a panel to end on. And then we go to the next panel. We find out that the Time Twisters actually aren't evil. They're just on this mission to go backwards in time to seek out the beginning of the universe on their quest for knowledge. So Thor and his friends ask them to stop because they're causing destruction wherever they go. but the Time Twisters reply, "Your request is understood, worldling, but what you ask is quite impossible. What matters the destruction of a mere thousand worlds to we who were born in the midst of chaos? Our father was the ultimate nova, the death of the primal sun. Our mother was the universe-shattering holocaust that followed." So, unable to defeat the Time Twisters, they eventually end up traveling all the way into the future, to the very birth of the Time Twisters at the beginning of the universe. Now, it's a very interesting concept, of course, because of the nature of comic books. It's so visual. Even with all the speech patterns here, there's not a lot of room to flesh out exactly what the science is here. But there's just enough to be intriguing, where we go to the end of the universe and the beginning of the Time Twisters. And I just thought it was a very inventive science fiction story there. But they're not all great. They can't all be winners. So then the next storyline here is much more mundane. This is Thor, and who is this? Firelord, in a much more mundane setting, and a revolution in a fictional Latin American country. Now, in the 1970s, there were a lot of revolutions going on in Latin America, so I guess this was ripped right from the headlines. It takes a very conservative view of the revolutions in Latin America, so the government is the good guy here, and the rebels are the bad guys who are just masquerading as wanting to help the people, when all they really want is just to help themselves, or just being evil for the sake of evil. One of the things, I was reading an early Iron Man comic book, again from the Marvel Essentials line, and was a little bit surprised at how Cold War the politics were. So the Chinese and the Russians were always the bad guys. Very conservative Cold War politics all throughout those early Marvel comics. I kind of thought by the late 70s that had gone out, but apparently not. But aside from the rather reactionary politics of it, it's just a rather boring storyline. But then we get included in this collection a Marvel Spotlight comics on the Warriors 3. So if we go back to the index here, it's Thor, but then they tossed into this collection a tie-in and a comic that was not the main Thor comic, the Marvel Spotlight, where Thor's three friends go on their own separate adventure. So Thor's in the jungles of Latin America. His three friends are left to entertain themselves in New York. They go out for a night on the town and then get sucked in to this big quest to rescue a guy who's being blackmailed into participating in a robbery, and in their quest to save him, they go from one place to the other, and it's just a very fun comic. The Warriors 3, I knew, of course, from the Thor movies. You may remember them. They appeared very prominently in the first Thor movie. They got sidelined in the second Thor movie, and they got killed off very unceremoniously in the third Thor movie, which I thought was a disservice to these characters who were very likable in the first movie. But yeah, here they are in the comics getting their own spotlight issue, and they are all throughout this volume. Now, while all this is going on, there's another story which is teased just slightly, which is that Odin is losing his mind up in Asgard. And Thor's friend, Baldur, is trying to warn people that Odin has lost his mind. Now, Baldur is somebody I recognized from Neil Gaiman's book on Norse mythology. He was one of the Norse gods as well, and he's portrayed as one of Thor's friends in these comics. So yeah, all the tie-ins to real Norse mythology are interesting. They go up to Asgard, and it turns out that the person masquerading as Odin is actually Mangog. So then we have to have a battle against the Mangog, but then once the Mangog is defeated, raises the question of where Odin is. So now they've got to go on a quest to find Odin. And once they go up to Asgard, Thor's lady friend Jane gets switched out for Lady Sif. Now there's something going on here, which again is something that was established in previous issues, where Sif and Jane actually share the same body. And so Thor is in love with them both, but he gets Lady Sif up on Asgard and Jane back down on Earth. And he has conflicted feelings. He doesn't know who he's really in love with. Which is... Oh, yeah. Yeah. Here it is. "'Tis not my thoughts that trouble me, Vizar. 'Tis my heart. I believed that I had lost it forever to the mortal Jane Foster. But, seeing the Lady Sif once more, feeling her tender hand upon my cheek, I simply do not know." So who is he really in love with? Well, this volume ends without a resolution to that question. And, again, you got to give credit for teasing this out over several issues, which take place over the course of a couple of years. So, again, the kids who are reading this in real time, that must have seemed like an eternity to them as time passes slower for kids. But yeah, Jane actually does not come back from this point on, because they spend the rest of the time up in space in Asgard, which is where Lady Sif, I guess, takes control of the body. Hela from the third Thor movie, and I looked this up on Wikipedia. She's based on the goddess Hel from Norse mythology, which I didn't need Wikipedia to tell me must be related to the English word hell. So interesting, all those little bits and pieces of mythology that you pick up along the way here. Speaking of which, where is it? They summon Mimir, who I had to look him up on Wikipedia because I forgot who he was, but once I read it, I did remember it from Neil Gaiman's mythology. That was Odin's advisor who got killed, but then Odin kept his head for advice. And so, yeah, again, another strange tale from Norse mythology. And yeah, mixed in here with some fantastical scenes here. A dragon that Thor and the troll have to fight together, and then some sort of being here. I mean, this whole everything on Asgard and in the Norse mythology just strikes me as very visually interesting and very imaginative. Here's the Rainbow Bridge, which is straight out of Norse mythology. They fly in a ship called the Starjammer, which I actually did not look this up, but I'm assuming Starjammer is just from the comics. And then they go out and have adventures out in space, encountering the Stone Men of Saturn, and some sort of tentacle type creature in a big spaceship. And twist ending, it turns out the tentacle creature was actually good. It was creating paradise for them. And then they encounter the Gray Gargoyle and his ship full of anthropomorphic animals, which they have to fight. Just a lot of fun ideas and fun concepts and interesting visuals all throughout this. Now, it's not adult literature. So I mean, it is something that would have been a lot better if I was 8 years old, and you know, it's a pity I didn't have access to this when I was 8 years old. But there you go. I mean, I would have loved this when I was 8, I'm sure. But it's still fun to read, entertaining to read. And then at the end we have the annual, which is placed at the end here, even though it comes out in 1976, because it's outside of the continuing storyline. This is going back to the early days of Thor, when Thor first met Hercules. When the Greeks were fighting the Vikings, which I don't believe the Greeks and the Vikings ever came into contact, but, you know, let that go. So Thor and Hercules fight, and then that leads to a huge battle between all the Norse gods and all the Greek gods. So, yeah, a lot of mythology in here. You know, comic books, I guess, to give credit where credit is due, I mean, these Thor comics obviously are entirely based on Norse mythology. I think both Marvel and DC make good use also of Greek mythology. I remember this from my days reading DC comics in the early 90s. The Wonder Woman and the Teen Titans with Donna Troy was heavily tied into the Greek gods of Olympus. And, you know, sometimes I think we on BookTube here, in our own kind of little bookish world, maybe forget how little the average person knows about Greek mythology. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just hanging out with the wrong people. But I sometimes find in my discussion with friends and coworkers that your average person really does not know or care much about Greek mythology at all. So, you know, give credit to the comic book readers of the world. The authors of this are assuming that they know who Apollo and Artemis and Hephaestus and all these Greek gods are, in addition to all of the mythology of the Norse gods. And the Valkyries coming down to get the souls for Valhalla. You know, it is. I don't want to claim this is great literature, but it is relying on some sort of cultural knowledge to absorb this. So, yeah, I found this a lot of fun to read, a lot of imagination. It was the portrayals of Norse mythology and the Rainbow Bridge and the dragons and oh yeah, here's Thor going into Valhalla to try and find Odin. That's all very interesting. But then they combine. Here's the Rainbow Bridge here. They combine these kind of trippy images from Norse mythology with some what I thought were some very inventive science fiction plots about time travel and the time twisters and the death of the universe and all that stuff. And it impressed me. I really liked it. So my first Marvel Epic collection, and I've got to say I'm impressed. I'll be reading at least one more of these because I bought two collections at the same time. The other one was the Incredible Hulk collection. So I'll start working on that one next.